I think what it does is it sends a message. First of all, a message to Bashar al-Assad that the support for the regime is not unconditional. With other words, the regime will have to compromise. And that was one of the major problems at the outset of the Geneva peace talks this week. The other one is that the Russians obviously feel that at this point they have stabilized the regime sufficiently not to need to further engage militarily at the level that they have done so. And the last point, I think, which is important, is that the Russians wanted to reestablish their place within the world international community. And that has become all the more significant now that we have seen some insight into what President Obama's strategic thinking is, which is one in which the Middle East plays a lesser role rather than a larger role.
So Russia's certainly feeling like they have achieved what they set out to achieve there in Syria. When you think about the ceasefire, dozens of airstrikes still continuing, but it has reduced the death toll. Now we're talking about in Geneva, peace talks underway there. Are we any closer to a resolution in Syria than we were 5 years ago?
I don't think we are. First of all, you have three major groups that control major chunks of territory. Keep in mind that the Assad regime only controls 20% of Syrian territory. You have three major groups, two of them jihadist, one of them Kurds, that are not involved in these negotiations. And without some sort of buy-in from groups like that, no matter how despicable you may find them, there's not going to be a restoration of Syria as the nation state. The other part of it is the pictures that you just showed. The moment the bombing started, the mass protests against Assad were revived. So, with other words, Assad's position from the point of view of at least the population in major parts of rebel-held territory is untenable.
I'm going to ask you a loaded question here because I think for the last 5 years we've been asking how this roadmap for peace in Syria ends. When you look at the talks in Geneva, on the one hand you've got the foreign minister of Syria saying any talk of removing Bashar al-Assad is a red line. On the other hand, you have the main opposition saying that they do not want him to play any role in the transitional government. Where can they find common ground?
That's the question, and I don't think there's an easy answer to it. And I don't think there's an easy answer for two reasons. One is Bashar al-Assad has nowhere to go. Where does he go if he were to resign? His security lies in remaining in power. From the opposition's perspective, this is the man who launched a brutal civil war. It's going to be very difficult to do business with him personally, not necessarily with people around him. And the other part of it is, how are you going to restore the nation state of Syria as it was prior to February or March 2011 if you're not controlling all of the territory? And at this point, for example, the Kurds do not wish to go back to a status quo ante.
Let's talk about the victims who are at the heart of this, the Syrian people who have been migrating to Europe on a massive level. We saw this weekend in Germany, Angela Merkel's party suffer a huge defeat as a result of the open door policy. But as you said, this conflict isn't going anywhere. It doesn't appear that way. What happens to the Syrian people if the Europeans, it's increasingly countries are starting to close their doors?
This is a refugee crisis on a scale that we haven't seen since World War II. And it's a real dilemma. It's a humanitarian dilemma. It is a political dilemma. A lot of these Syrians would like to go home. And if you were to get a long-term cessation of hostilities, I think you would see a lot of them return. But do keep in mind that the damage that has been done in this war is humongous. And for any of this to work, it's going to have to involve a really huge investment in the rehabilitation of whatever parts of Syria. And that countries often promise, but are short in terms of delivering on their promises.